Well, good evening. Today is August 4th, the 231st birthday of the United States Coast Guard, when Alexander Hamilton commissioned the Revenue Cutter Service. And not only it being Coast Guard Day, we have an excellent guest speaker to present the first AuxScout webinar of the season. I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Robin Pope. A little bit about Mr. Pope. He started off his professional career in oceanography, where he pursued a PhD. Now, what's interesting about Robin is that his maritime experience in oceanography gave him the opportunity to work in environments ranging from the Amazon to the Antarctic on both surface vessels and research submersibles. These days, professionally, Robin works as a physician's assistant with experience in many fields, including emergency medicine. However, his avocation or his passion for 40 years has been boating safety and aquatics education. He started his experience in aquatics as a lifeguard and sailing instructor. And for the past 30 years, his primary focus has been paddling. He currently serves as chair of the American Canoe Association's board of directors and as division chief for the United States Coast Guard Auxiliary's Paddlecraft Safety division, and holds the American Canoe Association's highest instructor ratings in swiftwater rescue and whitewater kayak. He's helped establish national education standards for boating and works with a number of state and national groups to address paddling and boating safety issues. And particular interest to the Sea Scouts, Robin is also skipper of ship 957 in Sylva, North Carolina, a contributing author of the latest edition of the Sea Scout Manual, the Kayaking Merit Badge pamphlet, and the Whitewater Merit Badge pamphlet, and has served in a wide range of scouting leadership roles. It's my pleasure to jump right into this topic, which is just as exciting, I think, for adult leaders and adult members as you, Robin Pope, to talk to us about paddlecraft safety.
PJ, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen and give a presentation. Give the right thing. So I'm going to talk about Sea Scouts and paddling, and this is an auxiliary and an AuxScout program. So the focus is really on sea scouting, but there's also going to be a strong focus on safety issues because scouting and the auxiliary both really focus on that. We want to make sure that our boaters go out, have fun, and come home safely. And okay, so in tonight's talk, I'll first talk about why we would even be interested in paddling as opposed to different types of boats, sailboats or power boats. Look at some of the safety concerns we might address, because as I speak with paddlers and people interested in paddling, I hear people express concerns about how safe it is. I hear about, we're going to run over giant waterfalls and we're going to get wolfed by waves, and we'll address that. Because we don't really do that. Talk about how to get started in paddling and what can we do once we get started in paddling. So right now, estimates are that there are about 25 million paddlers in the United States, people that are paddling in canoes, kayaks, rafts, and stand-up paddleboards. And many of them paddle different craft, more than one type of craft. But about 3/4 identify themselves as paddling in kayaks, and kayaks are clearly the fastest growing type of paddlecraft today. Reasons that we might look at doing it versus other craft are really, first, the low upfront cost and ongoing cost. I can get somebody into a kayak for a few $100s, and then the ongoing maintenance cost is essentially zero. I have a fleet of about 30 boats in my barn, and really my maintenance cost in the past year has been nothing. My insurance cost is nothing for it. The storage cost is nothing. Just sits in the barn or in a crawl space. And that's the second advantage. It really doesn't require any significant facilities for storage. And in terms of launching, all I need is a place where the water meets the shore. If I have a goat trail to get down to the water, that's all I need. We don't need marinas. We don't need big facilities. So that opens up the number of places that we can go paddling. And when we do it, we need a boat and a paddle and a life jacket and maybe a few other things, but the amount of equipment needed really is pretty minimal. And all of that leads to paddling being a lot of fun. There's some other reasons. Flexible transport. You've got a picture of my truck with 9 kayaks in and on it, room for maybe a 10th or 11th there. I don't think I can tow a boat that'll hold 11 people with my truck. Um, so it allows you to get to the water much more easily. And it's also flexible because if I did tow a boat that would hold 11 people, I'd probably need more than one person to actually operate it. With kayaks, canoes, and stand-up paddleboards, if I have 10 people, I bring 10 boats. If I only have 2 people, I bring 2 boats. So we have a little more flexibility in logistics. We also have flexible venues and the ability to combine venues. So we can see the picture with the sailboat and the sea kayaks. We can certainly go out on a trip and bring Paddlecraft with us and use them as a way to explore the areas that we sail and power to. We can go out in very calm environments in Paddlecraft, and we can look at more extreme environments, moving into whitewater or to big ocean surf. We can also travel to beautiful and remote areas and get into there where it would be difficult to bring a large vessel just because of the logistics of trying to bring something into a remote wilderness area. But as I said, we're going to talk about safety concerns first and get those out of the way. And waterfalls, giant waves, horrendous weather are things that people are scared of, and they're not what most paddlers should be worried about. That's not what causes paddling injuries. And even though paddling can be an extreme sport, if we follow the Guide to Safe Scouting, it almost never will be. Instead, most serious paddling accidents occur in easier conditions when somebody falls out of their boat and they can't get back in. And there have been a number of fatalities in the past year where this is exactly what happened. A condition just like you might see here, except there weren't a lot of people around that knew what they were doing. And the person in the water, instead of being dressed appropriately like this gentleman wearing a life jacket, didn't have a life jacket, didn't know how to swim, wasn't able to get back in their boat, and had a disastrous experience. Scouting's recognition that life jackets are important help us address that. So there's things we can do to make paddling safer. And clearly the first one is to wear your life jacket. And the second is to get hands-on lessons. If we look at boating accidents, most serious injuries and fatalities happen to people not wearing a life jacket who never had any instruction. So if we're doing that instruction, wearing life jackets and scouts, we've wiped out most of the problems. If we boat in a group, that's going to make sure that if we do get into trouble, that someone is there to help us. And if we look at the conditions, we're going to go boating in and then boat under control, and finally learn how to avoid falling out of the boat and what to do if it happens. You can see this group of scouts out there practicing wet exits and practicing deep water reentries. So if they do get into trouble, they're ready and prepared for it. Now, I said big waves, waterfalls, and horrendous weather generally aren't their concerns, but they can be. Fortunately, they're all things that are easy to miss. A bridge piling on the highway is also a serious concern if we drive into it, but the way to avoid that is don't drive into it. The way to avoid a big waterfall is don't paddle over it. Things that are less obvious are things like the powerboat that we see here, because powerboats, fast moving vessels, sometimes don't see paddlers. We're slow, small, and hard to see. So we need to assume that powerboats don't see us. We also need to recognize that sometimes powerboats and large vessels can't slow down and can't get out of our way. They're restricted by their draft, but restricted where they can operate. So it's our obligation to avoid collision, avoid problems, and stay out of those areas. Powerboats like this need at least 4 or 5 feet to operate. And I can paddle in 8 inches of water if I want to. So it opens up a lot of areas that are not accessible to powerboats and sailboats, and we can take advantage of that both to be safe and to have fun. Some things that might not seem like hazards, but that we want to make sure that our scouts and our auxiliaries avoid. And the first one is a low head dam. This is something that's relatively common on rivers. And if you're not familiar with them, they don't look dangerous. If you are familiar with them, they look awful. We can see on here the boil line representing the difference between water moving at the surface downstream and water at the surface moving back into the low head. So people paddle over this, they get stuck in here and have bad problems. So the way to address this problem is to walk around it. Debris in the water. This is a strainer. It's an object that would let water pass through, but not let you, your boat, or your gear pass through. And this is in a river, but we also have debris in open water conditions. And the challenge with this is that because we're land-based animals, if we get a little nervous or concerned, we want some extra stability and we reach out and grab that fixed object. And on land, when we're standing, that works. But on the water, it's like getting on a conveyor belt and grabbing on something. I don't actually encourage you to grab a tree when you ride past it on a bicycle, but you can imagine what would happen if you did. Same thing happens here. People get into trouble, and the best way to avoid this trouble is to avoid debris in the water, treat it like a real hazard. We are land-based animals. We like to walk, but unfortunately that doesn't work out so well all the time in the water because there's all sorts of stuff down on the bottom that we don't want to deal with. Rocks, fish hooks, all sorts of entrapment hazards. So when we enter the water, and the reality is that as paddlers, we're all between swims. Paddling is something that leads us to swim, and that's all part of the game. So we want to be aware of it and be able to do it well. When we're swimming, we stay up at the surface, keep our toes off the bottom, keep your nose and toes up in the air, and gently roll on your belly and swim where you need to go. If you are in moving water, it's okay to try and stand up if you can put your knees and palms on the ground. And if it's comfortable doing that, you're in good shape. Go ahead, stand up and do what you need to do, but be ready to get back and swim if you feel unsteady. The next hazard is cold water. And if there's an iceberg in the water, most people are going to recognize the water is cold. Medically, cold water is defined as 70 degrees Fahrenheit or less. And at that temperature, there is a potential for some potentially fatal cold water immersion problems. The colder the water gets, the more likely those are to happen. And below 50 degrees, it's almost guaranteed. So we dress to swim. And generally that means dressing more than you think you need to. How do you get started? Same as with anything else, start out slow and then advance your skills. So we can start out as this ship is doing in a quiet, protected area, learning here some signals to communicate when we're far enough apart that we can't yell or use other signals. I can't use auditory signals. So you can see the paddle is upright. That's saying that it's safe to come ahead. We then move out into open water conditions where it's a little bit more exposed. And again, emphasizing that this is a lot of fun. This is an area that it's tough to get to if you're not in a paddlecraft. It's difficult to get out there. And even if you are with an engine, you can't hear the background, you can't hear the birds and everything that's out there. So this is even though it's calm and quiet, is still an incredibly fun thing to do. We can look at trying different craft. So we showed kayaks, but we can also get into canoes. And as we're going through all of this, we recognize that learning how to take care of ourselves, learning how to help each other out if we swim out of our boat is always an important part of it. And you can see the scouts here practicing those deep water re-entries. If you want to paddle, you need to decide a little bit about what you want to do. And I've put up a bunch of different options here, mainly to emphasize that there are a huge number of options available to you. Choosing to paddle on lakes or oceans and rivers, each one of those requires somewhat different craft and planning. Each one of those is a lot of fun. Deciding what type of craft you want to paddle. Canoes, kayaks, stand-up paddleboards, or rafts. Part of that is going to be what you want to do, and part of that's going to be what's available to you. And we'll talk about how to decide that in a moment. Deciding what you want to do. It's totally different paddling a small local trip versus traveling a long distance and doing a one and done with the local outfitter where you go out, you have some fun, and then don't do it again. We're creating an ongoing development program. And then deciding if you want to focus on day trips or multi-day trips. One of the nice things about paddling is that you can choose to do all of these. Day trips that are done locally can lead into multi-day travel trips. Just for fun, you could do a one and done program with a local outfitter in a different type of boat or in a different venue. And we can always switch between canoes, kayaks, stand-up paddleboards, and rafts. And if you can take a kayak or a stand-up paddleboard or canoe out on the ocean, you can certainly do it on a lake or in a river also. So a lot of things that are available to you, and really all of them are available. But to get in the water, you do need to get some equipment to start out. And there are a lot of ways to do that. As part of a scouting program, we've got access to camps and councils, and they often have boats and equipment. And that's a great place to start. They often have instructors that are affiliated with them or can tie us into instructors to make sure that we get that initial positive experience. In some areas of the country, we have access to paddling schools. Where I live in Western North Carolina, there are half a dozen or more very strong paddling schools, and many of them have affiliation with Scout units or with Scout camps. They can get you out on the water with a complete set of equipment and with some highly trained instructors. Outfitters and liveries, essentially programs that rent paddlecraft, can get you out on the water, and they often can provide some additional instruction, as can parks and recreation programs in counties and cities. Those are all pretty straightforward to find. You can Google them, look them up in a directory, and it's easy to find them. Other things that are easy to find are paddling stores, because that's going to be a source of equipment. And it's often a way to contact manufacturers and find out manufacturers that are willing to donate or provide a significant price discount if we're buying equipment from them. There are several manufacturers who in the past have provided discounts that make new equipment comparable in price to used equipment, and that helps us get onto the water quickly. Groups that might be a little harder to find but are definitely worthwhile are paddling clubs. And simply Googling paddling clubs or looking on the American Canoe Association's website can help you find those. Lots of paddling clubs in the US have really outstanding instructional programs. And not only do they provide instruction, but they provide trips and mentoring. So it's a way to get scouts, get individuals, get even adult leaders trained and involved with ongoing paddling development. And then finally, just looking for individual paddlers, because individual paddlers are a huge resource for unit leadership and training. And that's true both within the Sea Scout program and within the auxiliary AuxScout and AuxPad programs. So when you get started, go out and run a trip just for fun. Take a merit badge class, take a class from a club camper school. However it happens, go out and get the paddling bug. And once you have the bug, you need to start looking at your personal equipment. And the first thing, as I said, is a life jacket. There are a number of well-designed paddling life jackets that are comfortable when they paddle. You tend to have wide armholes for arm motion. They tend to be short-waisted so that when you're sitting down in a boat, it's not difficult to sit there comfortably. And they all provide flotation. Many of them provide thermal protection and impact protection, and we don't always think about impact protection until you see a group of 20 scouts learning how to paddle and running into each other. Or you see scouts swimming through whitewater, swimming in surf and bouncing off rocks. If you look at the life jacket that I teach in, you can see impact protection is actually a pretty good thing. Another thing that's nice is potentially providing storage and visibility. You can see the large pockets on this life jacket, makes it easy to store snacks, rescue equipment, communications equipment. And depending on the color, they might be a brightly colored, highly visible thing that'll help other boaters see us. If you're going to paddle, you need a paddle. And we've got a couple paddles pictured here. Kayak paddles definition have 2 blades, canoe and stand paddleboard and raft paddles have 1. Paddles are often made of aluminum or plastic at kind of the low end, fiberglass in the mid-range, and then carbon fiber at high end. And we look at that, a balance of strength, weight, and cost. And generally you can get 2 of those that are good. It's hard to get all 3. Paddles are designed for a particular venue. So a sea kayaking paddle tends to be lighter and less strong than a whitewater paddle, because in whitewater, we anticipate bouncing the paddle off of rocks. Not many rocks out in the middle of the ocean that we're going to run into. In general, lighter paddles are better, stronger paddlers are better, and better is in general more expensive. So starting with the middle of the road paddle that you're going to use, hundreds of hours. If we look at how fast most people paddle, we typically take about 30 strokes a minute if we're paddling for speed. 30 strokes a minute, 60 minutes, an hour, that's 1,800 strokes an hour. And if you do that for 2 or 3 hours with a heavy pedal, your shoulders are going to know about it. Investing a little bit will make you happier. As we look at the type of boats that we might paddle, I said kayaks are the most common, and I'm going to show 4 different types of kayaks. And we first look at whitewater boats versus touring kayaks. These 2 pictures are definitely not to scale. The bright red boat over here is a whitewater boat. It's about 9 feet long. You can see that it has quite a bit of rocker. The elevation at the stern and up at the bow relative to the bottom portion of the deck is quite different. And that allows the boat to turn. If it's in rivers, the rivers are going downstream, I don't need to worry about speed so much as maneuvering around rocks. And this high rocker formation helps me do that. They tend to have some rescue points. You see points back here that you would grab onto. And these tend to be relatively slow. They're not designed for speed, they're designed for maneuverability. In contrast, the sea kayak, and the picture here is about 14 feet long. The sea kayak has much less rocker than a whitewater boat, and you can see it has a skeg or a drop-down keel to help the boat track in a straight line, because that's what it's designed to do. Many sea kayaks have storage areas. So there's a storage hatch aft here and up at the bow for overnight trips, make it easier to store material for camping. 2 other types of boats you might see. The green boat is a recreational kayak. These tend to be a little bit shorter. This one's about 9 feet long. The big thing they are is beamier. They're much wider than many other boats, and that width gives some extra stability. The cost of that extra stability is a lack of speed. So these boats are typically seen in areas where you're not planning to paddle long distance, but they're relatively inexpensive and accessible, good for easy lake conditions. Another thing that we'll often find is a sit-on-top kayak, and sit-on-top kayaks are just what they describe. Instead of having a deck where your legs go under, everything is on top of the boat. That means that if you're concerned about being stuck in the boat when you capsize, and even though that's something that is not really to be worried about, if you're in a sit-on-top boat, you don't have to worry about that. Some sit-on-top boats are designed for very calm and protected conditions. Others have some pretty significant high-performance modifications. And this one has thigh straps that allow you to lock your legs in, provide a lot more stability. You can see the little white spots. Those are all self-bailing holes that make this a little bit more appropriate for rougher conditions. If you want to kayak, you need to look at what's available to you and the conditions that you want to go into. A sit-on-top kayak is a great way to get people into the water, and if you choose the right one, it will have some high performance capability. Whitewater kayaks obviously better for whitewater, touring kayaks better for open water, oceans and lakes. We know that hull speed is a function of length, so a whitewater boat being shorter is going to be slower. Sea kayaks, typically 14 to 17 feet long, are going to travel a lot faster. Talk about kayaks, but anybody that's been involved in any scouting program has probably been exposed to canoes. And canoes are the traditional scouting craft. They're a craft that's been used in North America for many years, for centuries, and it's a great way to get scouts out in the water and exploring. And the chances of your local council having these are very high. The last boat to mention are stand-up paddleboards. The popularity of these has just exploded in previous years. Growth over the last decade has been more than 200%. Stand-up paddleboards are among the simplest craft. It's literally a board that you stand on and paddle. You can have some deck rigging, as you notice up here, lines that will hold equipment down. There are people that do multi-day camping trips off stand-up paddleboards. One of the nice things about a stand-up paddleboard is that it's not just a paddle craft, it's also a mobile diving board. If you want to go out and use it to go swimming off of, it's easy to get off, easy to get on, just another way to have a lot of fun. Also, some of them are inflatable, which means it's much easier to transport them in another vessel. You could roll it up while it's deflated, use a power boat or sailboat to get to your destination, and then inflate it and use it to paddle the area. There's a bunch of other equipment that we need to look at. I've put pictures of footwear up here. Your feet are down in the butt of your boat, walking over sharp rocks and debris. It's always important to have something to protect your feet. And we like to have closed-toed shoes to make sure that your toes aren't damaged. I said we want to dress for the water conditions, dress to swim. This is kind of the extreme of that, wearing a dry suit with seals at the neck and the wrist and locked in feet so that water stays completely out and we can insulate ourselves. But it might be something as simple as a rash guard to keep sun off of us. We just need to make sure that we're wearing the equipment to keep us comfortable. There's still a lot of other stuff that we want to have depending on the venue. So we always want to think about communications, and there are lots of ways we can do that. The simplest is just a whistle, which is a way to let other boaters know what's going on around us. Could include a cell phone, VHF radio, Motorola, walkie-talkie, lots of different things we can use. It's also important to have chart and navigation tools because we want to know where we're going. And sometimes that's just knowing where the river put in and takeout is and knowing that there's a road to one side. Sometimes that's having a detailed navigational chart, sitting down and plotting out your courses. Rescue tools and first aid kits. We're out there on our own. We need to be prepared to take care of ourselves and take care of our team, and having rescue and repair kits, rescue tools, repair kits, and first aid kits, along with survival equipment in case we have to spend the night, are all really important. And then food and water. When we're on the water for a long time, we're going to get dehydrated. We need to make sure we bring drinking water and food with us. Some of this equipment is going to be constant pretty much everywhere. All paddlers, all boats are required to have a sound producing device, and most paddlers will meet that requirement by having a whistle and attaching the whistle to their life jacket. So if they get in trouble, they're not depending on their boat, they've got the equipment with them. Others are really venue specific. Someone who is paddling in the ocean or in a large lake might bring a VHF radio. Someone who is paddling in a river might be down in a valley where a VHF radio is useless. So taking the time to get that hands-on instruction and some mentorship to make sure that you learn what you need will make you have more fun. The next step is going to be learning the basics. And here's an instructional class on calm water, and the students in here are learning how to exit their boat after a capsize. As we said, capsizing, falling overboard is part of paddling in particular, and we want to make sure you know how to do that. Then you want to know how to make the boat move under control, so forward, backward, and sideways, how to turn and how to stop. And that seems straightforward, and it generally is, but taking the extra half hour or hour to get competent instruction and coaching and feedback helps you do this a lot better. If you think of paddling like bicycling, we could put you on a bicycle and you would eventually figure out how to do it, but you'd fall and scrape yourself up a number of times. I put you in a canoe or kayak and you'll probably figure it out eventually, but giving you the coaching will help you figure out faster, have a lot more fun, be a lot more efficient when you do it. Then recognize that each paddling venue has some specific rescue and knowledge skills that we want. So go out and get the training necessary to help yourself in that venue. This is a wading drill to access someone that's stuck in a whitewater environment. Critical skill in whitewater, not so useful in a lake. So learn what you need to learn for the venue. And recognize that each trip deserves planning, so we want to plan to have fun. And let's look at how to do that planning. When we plan a trip, some key elements, key points that we want to know. The first is, where are we going to get on the water and where are we going to get off? Having a map or a chart or something that gives us that information and allows us to communicate it to everybody in our group helps us succeed with the trip, helps us have more fun. We want to know who's going on the trip and what's their experience. Because that'll help make sure that we plan the trip appropriately. We wouldn't want to take someone who's never paddled before and put them on a multi-day overnight trip. without having some experience beforehand. Last thing you want to do is get 4 hours into the trip and have someone realize that this is just not for them, or realize that their shoulders aren't holding up to the stress of the adventure, or that they probably should have had a waterproof bag for their down sleeping bag after they flipped their canoe. So making sure that everybody knows their experience, everybody shares what's going on, allows us to set up some clear objectives for the trip and make sure that those are clearly understood by everybody. Hopefully that type of planning prevents emergencies, but we know those happen. So coming up with some emergency action plans, deciding who's going to be the lead in the trip, who's going to be at the back of the group, how do we keep the group together, what do we do if a problem happens? And common problems are going to be capsizing and falling overboard. Once the person is in the water, making sure that the boat and the person stay together, making sure they get back in quickly, making sure before that happens that all the gear is properly stored so that it doesn't fall to the bottom of the lake. We do want to think about how long the trip is, because the equipment and supplies you need for an hour-long trip on a local lake are totally different than what you need for a rafting expedition down the Grand Canyon. So getting a clear plan, making sure you have all the needed supplies, and then recognizing that some of those supplies might get in trouble. If the boat capsizes, some of them might disappear. So the same concept we'd use for backpacking of having an extra meal and some extra clothes applies to paddling. Putting in extra food can always make a difference. Worst thing that's going to happen is you'll have a good meal at the end of the day. And then we want to file a float plan, and we'll talk about a float plan in a minute. Two key elements that we want to look at are the weather conditions and the water conditions. Just as with any other outdoor adventure, we need to know what the weather is going to do. Becomes even more important because if we're hiking and it pours rain on us, we get wet. And that's not a big deal. But if the type of rainstorm that you see on the weather radar here leads to the type of water flow that you see over here under the bridge, not only do we get wet, we get flushed downstream. We have lots of issues. So we want to know what the weather is going to be like. We want to know what the water conditions are right now, and we want to have an idea of what those water conditions are going to be in the future. And it goes back to our emergency action plan. If we know that what we expect is not exactly what's happening, then we want to know what to do to deal with that. A great example of that is one of the best trip reports I've ever read in a paddling magazine. A group said that they went to the river, they looked at it, they had done their planning, and the water was still a bit higher than they thought it should be, quite a bit higher actually, but they thought they'd be okay. They got on the water and they started heading downstream, and immediately people started flipping and swimming, and it was disastrous. They got everybody to shore, got everybody together, realized they had not lost anything, looked upstream and realized they could still see the cars where they got in the water, and said, you know what, we're going to go back to the cars, go home, watch videos and drink hot chocolate. And I think that that's working for. If your plan isn't working out, be flexible, be willing to change it, because the water is always going to be there. We want to make sure that we're there to come back and enjoy it later. So how do you find weather and water conditions? Well, National Weather Service is probably the source that many of us go to. There are lots of weather apps and there are lots of local weather applications. WeatherBug and local weather, local yocal weather are things that I use in my area, but find out what's available in your area and what gives the most accurate predictions. Lots of water conditions are available. Surfforecast.com is a way to get surf forecasts around the globe. And that surf forecast can give you an indication of other water conditions and weather conditions. The U.S. Geological Survey has a list of rivers that they keep water stages on, and then you can use that to predict what you need to do. And as a note here, there are lots of other sources that are available. Big thing is to go back to the paddling clubs, go back to the individual paddlers in your area, and as you're learning, find out how do they figure out what's a good time, what are good conditions to paddle, and then use their resources, basically learning from their experience. It's nice to have a written float plan, though, something that tells everybody what's going on. The Coast Guard Auxiliary has a float plan at Float Plan Central. The website's shown up here. There's a printed one here, and you can download that from boated.com. If you just Google float plan, you'll get all sorts of different things that are easy to fill out. The key message here is to let somebody know where you're going, let them know roughly what you're doing, and what to do if you're overdue. And as an example, a very simple float plan, when my son and I paddle on a local river that we've done hundreds of times and know intimately, the plan is simply for me to tell my wife, David and I are going to paddle the Tuckasegee River. We'll be off at 4. If you haven't heard from us by 5, call Sam. And Sam is a friend of mine who lives on the river and could drive up and down and find us. And as an expert paddler, he could get in and help us if we needed to. She already knows what car we're driving. She knows what boats we're in. She knows our skill level. She can convey all that to law enforcement or rescue personnel if needed. The float plan that's here has a lot more detail, asking about names, addresses, information about your boats, and all of that's important. Make sure that you use these. And perhaps the most important thing is when you're actually off the water, call the person who has your float plan and let them know you're back safely so they don't initiate a search for you. So you've done all that. You want to know where to go next. What do you do? Well, we start on day trips on protected waters. Go to a lake, go out with friends, and from there, the options are wide open. One option that people like to do is overnight camping with paddle camping. And there are a couple ways to do that. One can be a multi-day trip from point A to point B on a lake or along the ocean. On the North Carolina coast, you could do that on Shackleford Banks. Hammocks Beach State Park has several areas you could do that. Lots of places that you could make this happen. And I know many other states, other areas have similar things. Another nice option is to paddle from a base camp. So find a lake, find a river, and do different sections every day, returning to your starting point. There's some people that will do this on a lake or from an ocean beach and go out and do a circumnavigation of an island or do one portion of the lake and come back. It's also possible for rivers to have a base camp at a campsite, drive to the river, do your paddling trip, and come on back. This gives you an opportunity to split your group up based on interest and ability. It gives you an opportunity to progress your skills, starting with simple and more complex, and get a lot of paddling in a few days. It's also an opportunity to work on your long cruise award or to conduct a quartermaster cruise. Other options for this are to go to high adventure camps, Northern Tier for Scouts, the Summit Reservation, and then there are lots of similar smaller programs out there. Google is your friend to find those. And then as you want to advance, either as an auxiliarist or as a scout leader, go get some instructor training. The scouting and the auxiliary have a very strong relationship with the American Canoe Association. We use ACA's instructional program, and more information is available at the ACA website. So some take-home messages. Plan and prepare to have fun. That's the big thing we want to do. Start small. It gives you an opportunity to go big later on. Get some hands-on on-water training. Get the equipment that you need, particularly including life jackets. Manage your risks, which include dressing to swim, and then understanding, anticipating, and preventing the problems that are likely to happen in your venue. Build your experiences, build your skills, go out there, have a great time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Robin, for this excellent presentation. I'm inspired to try paddle camping. I'll tell you that it's been on my list, but just going through this webinar with you, I think the spark has been reignited. We do have a question from Jason, and it could also lead into maybe a little discussion about maybe some equipment crafts that fit different needs. But Jason is debating between getting a 17-foot aluminum canoe, which he would have to store in his backyard, and a raft, which you'd store in the garage. So what are some of the pros and cons of both type of craft if you're talking aluminum canoe stored outside versus
Mhm.
raft, and in terms of utility as well?
Sure. So an aluminum canoe is the craft that explored a lot of the rivers. After World War II, well, there was a tremendous amount of aluminum production. It turned into canoes, and we got in there and did all sorts of boating. So they are very durable. They are they're seaworthy, and you can do a lot of things with them. Outdoor storage should be fine. You might get some galvanization of the aluminum. I'm not sure that's the correct term. You might get some just weathering on it, but people store aluminum canoes outside for decades, and they do fine. Uh, Aluminum canoes are going to be paddled by a 17-foot, probably by two people, although you could rig it to do a one-person trip. So it would be good on a wide variety of conditions and would allow you to paddle by yourself or with one or two other people. A raft, depending on the size, generally is going to require more people to paddle, although there are some smaller ones, and is generally going to be more of a moving water boat. So a canoe you would reasonably use on rivers or on lakes, and probably not on oceans, but potentially on a sound or very protected bay. A raft you're really going to be using only on moving water because they don't turn very well. They don't go in a straight line very well. They kind of move downstream nicely, and then you nudge them around. Um, in terms of storage, storing a raft in an indoor protected area deflated is what most people do. Having said that, there's rafters that do truly impressive trips, and if you're going to do multi-day trips, the advantage of a raft is the amount of stuff that you can carry in it. I have friends that do, multi-week trips, and they eat way better than I eat. They eat on their trips way better than I eat at home. It's just a matter of having the equipment and putting it in the raft and carrying it down the river. Another thing to consider is how you're going to propel the raft. So most rafts are propelled by paddles, but you can also set up an oar rig, and that would allow you to paddle the raft by yourself. Using an oar rig turns the raft into a giant rowboat, tremendously maneuverable. You use long sweep oars and can get a lot of power out of them. Does that answer your question, Jason? Hope so.
If Jason doesn't have anything to add to his question, I have another question that's related to water quality.
Mhm.
Is something a factor like bacteria, water bacteria? Is that ever a really concerned when you're paddling, or is coming home and taking a really good shower sufficient? So are there any extra kind of concerns with those kind of like
Mhm.
biological hazards of
Right.
water quality?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it in some cases, yes, and I think many people would be aware of waterways that are polluted, and if you look at it and it's grossly polluted, you probably shouldn't paddle in it, just as you probably shouldn't swim in it. Um, I think that in most cases, if you look at the water and your first thought is not, that's gross, I'm not getting in it, uh, taking a shower when you get home, and honestly, if you paddle all day, you're covered in sweat. No matter what the temperature is outside, you're probably taking a shower anyway. Um, Conditions that answer changes depending on how much time you spend in the water. And clearly, the more time you spend in the water, the more likelihood of swallowing water that might have contaminants, getting water into your sinuses, leading to a sinus infection or a stomach infection, becomes an issue. But in general, unless you're spending a lot of time swimming in contaminated water, or you're swimming in grossly contaminated water, it's adequate to take a shower when you get home.
Okay, good question. Um, maybe last question here. Maybe can offer a story or an observation. You've had paddling experience all over the world over many years. Can you think of a time, whether it was yourself or someone in a group or outside, that you observed who has had a lot of paddling experience and maybe unintentionally made a misjudgment, something they should have known better to do, but they didn't do it and there was some sort of consequence, not tragic, but something went afoul and they should have just known better.
Um, I think many paddlers have that experience. And it's the experience, and I certainly have. In general, I'd say it's the experience that a lot of outdoor people have of, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Should I stop or should I go do one more thing? I, on myself, after doing a multi-day trip where we camped at a base camp, went to different rivers every day. After 7 or 8 days of that, I tried to do a very difficult river move that I had done very well on day 2 of the trip, but probably was too tired. Well, definitely was too tired to try on day 8 of the trip. Led to a really uncomfortable swim, and I should have known better. I shouldn't have done that. I think that I know plenty of boaters that say, I knew I should have just held back, or I knew I should have put on more clothes, or I knew that the weather was coming up and I didn't. I think that the fact that we're all here to tell those stories says that even if we make a mistake, if we've done good planning on the bigger picture, have proper equipment, have people with us that know how to back us up and help us out, and then are part of a paddling community. One of the things that I really like about paddling is that the vast majority of people who paddle are just genuinely good, nice people. The community ethos is that if you see somebody in trouble, you go and help them. And I don't always see that in other outdoor pursuits or other activities, but in paddling, there really is the community ethos that we all take care of each other. Um, that's why we get through when we make a mistake.
Wow, I think that's really an excellent take-home message that we'll end the presentation on. But I want to thank you for sharing that personal experience first and foremost. I think we've all been there. Things that we think we know really well or should know better, particularly when it comes to weather, tide, and time,
Yes.
sometimes get the
Hmm.
better of us. And
Yes.
but your message is here to serve as our warning and something to think about. And thank you for mentioning how how strong the paddling community is. And hopefully people that are, whether scouts or auxiliaries or adult leaders that are not into paddlecraft yet, but are considering, maybe like Jason, getting a canoe, raft, stand-up paddleboard, kayak. Um, Hopefully this presentation was a really good starting point to give you those solid first steps on how to enter the sport safely. Um, but I know that I certainly take Robin's message home of community, of finding an instructor, finding a paddling community, maybe within your own Sea Scout ship. So you have any other parting words for us, Robin, before we close out this webinar?
Um, I, I will say I'm primarily a whitewater boater, and I certainly enjoy that. But again, a really nice thing about paddling is that you can enjoy it in a huge range of conditions. I'll close up telling what's really my best paddling experience, and that was taking a kayak out on the ocean on an absolutely flat, calm day. Uh, Almost no wind. There couldn't have been more than an inch high ripple. Water quality was incredible. You could see down 6 or 10 feet. And while I was out paddling, I had dolphins swim up and swim under my boat. And that's just a magical experience. And you can't do that with any other type of boat. So go out, have fun with it, enjoy those magical experiences. And whatever you do in a paddlecraft, whatever type of paddlecraft you choose to paddle, you'll have a lot of fun and you'll get to do things that you just can't do any other way.
All right. Well, thank you again,
You're welcome.
Robin Pope, for sharing your time and your national expertise with us on paddlecraft safety. This webinar is available on the AuxScout YouTube channel for viewing on your own timetable, and we hope that you will join us in October for our next AuxScout webinar. September. Join us in September for our next AuxScout webinar, joining Lieutenant Jacob Brown from the United States Coast Guard Academy to talk about the admissions process and the AIM program for rising seniors in high school. Again, thank you, Robin, and I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar.